A WSMV4 investigation uncovered multiple DUI arrests dismissed from arrests, all made by one officer in Goodlettsville.
So it's the latest discovery by Chief Investigative Reporter Jeremy Finley into how you can be sober and still get a DUI.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. Recently, there's been a good bit of attention drawn to people who were arrested for DUI, but who were actually sober and innocent and were exonerated through the court system. Now, I've seen stories from all over the place, including neighboring states like Georgia and Alabama, but most of the attention are cases that I've seen out of the Middle Tennessee area, specifically Nashville and Goodlettsville. Since the story has come to the public forefront recently, I've had a bunch of people in my comments or in email or personally ask me about my position on these cases. And just today I saw that Justin Timberlake himself had been arrested overnight for DUI. And the media reports about his arrest reveal what I consider to be a very big mistake that Justin Timberlake allegedly made in the process of complying with police officers. So I've decided that it's time, as a former prosecutor in the state of Tennessee, to address the issue and give you some thoughts as to why I think things are the way they are, and shed some light on the anatomy of a DUI case and how it's constructed or deconstructed. As an illustration, we'll look at a recent news story from WSMV4 Nashville and look at how they covered the case, and we'll come back and talk about it.
I certainly regret that, and I really deeply I hurt for what they went through.
That is an apology from the police chief of Goodlettsville to innocent people arrested by his police department.
Performing a field sobriety test is not what Jeff Adams expected last September as he was heading to his job as a teacher in Brentwood.
I figured I could pass it because I wasn't drinking. I was on my way to school. It was 5:52 a.m.
Video recorded by an officer shows Adams didn't do well standing on one leg. Still, Adams couldn't believe what happened next. Listen.
Sir, I have not drank a penny. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do drugs.
And Adams wasn't lying. 4 months later, his blood test results show no alcohol, no drugs. But the arresting officer, Noah Werner, wrote he showed several signs of impairment.
I don't think you're safe to operate a motor vehicle.
Can I call my school to let them know that I need a substitute?
The case against Adams was ultimately dismissed. The damage, though, was already done.
It was the most traumatic experience to know that I'm being arrested. I'm about to be fingerprinted, mugshotted. All the man's got is his reputation and his name. And it's getting smeared, and I didn't appreciate it.
Chokes you up a little bit.
It does.
And a WSMV4 investigation found this isn't the only DUI arrest made by Officer Werner that was dismissed. Turns out Adams is the third sober driver to be arrested by Werner for a DUI last year.
There's a problem. There's a pattern, is what this is.
I certainly regret that, and I really deeply I hurt for what they went through.
Chief Gary Goodwin is Werner's boss at Goodlettsville Police.
If you had just one case, that would be one thing. But in this officer's case, you have 3 people who were sober and arrested for DUI. So what does that tell you?
It doesn't necessarily tell me anything. Obviously, it's concerning. You hate it for these 3 people.
Goodwin admits he's frustrated by the situation. Look at the reports. All 3 drivers, including Adams, showed multiple signs of impairment. In one case, a driver had a half-empty beer can in the driver's side door, but they were all found to be sober.
I'm looking at them and I'm saying, I'm not sure how I fix this.
And an ongoing WSMV4 investigation shows it's not just Goodlettsville. Police are arresting sober people for DUIs all over the mid-state. And because of a backlog at the TBI for alcohol and toxicology reports, we found some innocent drivers are waiting 8 months to get results back. And in many times, sober drivers are asking for breathalyzers. Listen. But they didn't. You can see in the video, Adams was taken to get a blood draw instead. After that, he was taken to jail.
Why not use a breathalyzer each time? That would at least tell you if that person had been drinking alcohol.
So many people that we see now, they're under the influence, but it's not necessarily alcohol.
And a blood test, which takes longer to get back, is the only way to know for sure.
I just put myself in their position, and how would I feel if this happened to me?
Adams knows how it feels each and every time he drives past where he was arrested.
Sometimes I'll refer to it as the scene of the crime, because it was a crime against me.
Jeff Adams kept his job as a teacher. He was not suspended. The additional problem is that he also drives for Uber, and because of his arrest, Uber suspended him. And he estimates he lost out on $15,000 in potential earnings.
Jeremy, this story was so hard to watch. So is Goodlettsville police doing anything different as a result of this?
Well, the chief says they're reviewing these cases to see if there's anything they need to be doing differently in their field sobriety testing. But the real challenge is that there are so many real drunk drivers, police can't take the risk of not arresting somebody, even if they suspect them of being intoxicated. But these drivers are angry and they are asking for change. Lauren?
Okay, Jeremy, thanks for always covering this for us. We'll look forward to the next update.
So as we could see in the video, there were several people that were arrested and featured in this news story and who turned out to be completely innocent and were exonerated through blood test results after they were arrested and dragged through the court system. In one of those cases that I found particularly poignant, you have a guy who is a teacher and has been for several years, and he's got students who look up to him, and his life was basically ruined, and he was out several $1,000s to prove that he wasn't a drunk driver. This is not the first time that this happens. It's not the last time it's going to happen, and you'll get an idea as to why as we go through this story. But the vast majority of the people who were featured in these stories and who were arrested around the country have one thing in common, and they also share this thing in common with Justin Timberlake, and that is that they voluntarily participated in standardized field sobriety tests when asked by law enforcement. So I'm going to break down the nomenclature of a DUI investigation and how it builds towards and triggers a person's obligation to submit a blood or breath test under the standard implied consent law, and how a person can avoid being arrested and or convicted of DUI. So first, let's take a look at how it usually starts. So normally a DUI investigation starts with a traffic stop. An officer observes some erratic driving pattern, or maybe it's failure to maintain a single lane, maybe it's being left of center, maybe it's driving with no headlights after dark, whatever. Or the officer makes some stop for something else, like running a stop sign or speeding or something that doesn't necessarily initially trigger a suspicion for DUI, but during the encounter with the person, the officer, for whatever reason, decides to undertake some sort of external investigation about that person's level of intoxication. Maybe the officer will testify to bloodshot and watery eyes, or slurred speech pattern, or confusion when trying to fumble around and get documents, or when they ask the person out of the vehicle. Maybe they had a hard time maintaining their balance, or they leaned on the door, or they were unsteady on their feet, or whatever the standard stuff is. But somewhere along the way, the officer will ask, or demand in some cases, that people participate in standardized field sobriety tests. Now, just for the record, I'm going to tell you what field sobriety tests are, and you probably already know, but in case you don't, we'll give you an idea. Field sobriety tests are exercises that I would argue are loosely based on scientific data that asks a person to combine some physical demonstration of their body mechanics with some mental exercise that focuses on divided attention. And they, at their core, are designed to alert the officer and build evidence that the person is potentially impaired. There are 3 standardized field sobriety tests that are recognized by NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They are the horizontal gaze nystagmus. This is where an officer uses a pen or something with a defined tip or point to try to get the person to track with their eyes only across a flat line in front of the person's face. So you'll see the officer say, focus on the tip of my pen, and they'll go back and forth like this right here. The idea is that you want to track whether or not the eyes of the person bounce involuntarily as it tracks the object that it's looking at. So you get all the way out here. This is called maximum deviation, or it's like 45 degrees out here. And if you hold the pen out here, if the person has nystagmus, you'll see the eyes bouncing back and forth like this. And so the officer makes notes as to whether or not there's a lack of smooth pursuit. In other words, whether the eyes bounce as they're tracking, or whether there's a nystagmus at maximum deviation, in other words, way out here, and you're holding the pen out here and the person's trying to look and their eyes are shaking, or whether there's vertical nystagmus when you hold the pen up here or whatever. And so if the person's eyes shake, the data, so if there is nystagmus or an involuntary shaking or bouncing of the eyes, the data suggests that that person, based on a certain percentage, I think it used to be like 77% of the time, if the person has nystagmus, they are impaired. Then the second one's the walk and turn, and that's where you ask a person to take 9 heel-to-toe steps on an imaginary line forward, and then to take a series of small steps when they get to the end to turn, and then take 9 heel-to-toe steps back on the same imaginary line. And the officer will observe clues like whether or not the person stepped heel-to-toe, whether or not they had to use their arms for balancing, whether or not they stepped off the line, whether they used their arm for balancing, whether or not they paid attention to the instructions, and that kind of stuff. And then you have the one-leg stand, and that's where the subject is asked to raise their foot approximately 6 inches off the ground, stare at their toe while they point their toe in a particular direction, and then count aloud basically until the officer gets tired, but normally it's around 30 seconds. And then what the officer will try to observe during this period of time is whether or not they were able to maintain their balance without swaying, whether or not they had to use their arms for balance, whether or not they actually followed directions, whether or not they put their foot down before the officer told them to stop, that kind of thing. And then the officer will use the certain number of clues or the certain clues that come along with the standardized training on those tests to decide whether the person passed or failed. The most common misconceptions about these field sobriety tests are, number one, that a person is required to do field sobriety tests. They are absolutely 100% voluntary. They're not required. No one can physically force a person to do field sobriety tests. The second misconception is that a person automatically loses their driver's license if they refuse to do field sobriety tests, which also isn't true. There is a thing called implied consent where every person who accepts a privilege to drive in the state agrees that upon an officer having probable cause that they've committed the offense of DUI, that they will give their blood or breath. If probable cause is established, that is what triggers the person's obligation to supply a blood or breath test under the implied consent law. And then after the probable cause has been established under the totality of the circumstances, something we'll learn about again in a few minutes, then that person loses their driving privileges if they refuse the blood or breath test. And number three, a common misconception is that CDL holders have some different obligation as it relates to field sobriety tests. They don't. There are some other penalties that come into a CDL, and there's some information out there that a CDL holder has a 0.04 blood alcohol concentration instead of a 0.08. That is not true in every state. It depends on the state law, but most cases, it is if a person is driving a commercial vehicle, that's when the blood alcohol concentration gets lowered to 0.04. If a person has a CDL and they're in their private capacity or in their private vehicle, they have the same laws and regulations that everybody else has. I actually have a CDL, and yes, I did get my CDL after becoming a lawyer, which is kind of a strange trajectory, but that's another time and another story for another video. But I was sitting in truck driving school as an attorney, listening to them try to teach me all this garbage and try to convince everybody in the class that you had a lowered 0.04 BAC as a CDL holder, even in your private vehicle. And I corrected them, and they had to acknowledge that they didn't know what they were talking about. They also, as an aside, tried to tell people that you couldn't have a gun in a commercial vehicle because it was a federal crime, which exists exactly nowhere in the law and is complete nonsense. And they had to admit that as well, but I digress. The point is, people teaching truck drivers in truck driving school have no idea what they're talking about. So if you're a truck driver and you're getting all worked up over this information and you're thinking that I'm telling you nonsense, just there you go. That's the answer. There's no federal law that says you can't have a gun in a commercial vehicle. But anyway, back to DUIs. Now, the most common mistakes that people make when they're dealing with law enforcement on a DUI investigation is, number one, they answer itinerary questions. Things like, where you been tonight, how much you had to drink, where are you headed to, where do you live? Don't answer any of those questions. You're not required to answer those questions, and every time you open your mouth, it gives the officer an opportunity to testify about what he smells or observes about your speech and about what he smells or observes about your breath. So the less you talk, as in any other interaction with police, the better you are. The second of the most common mistakes is that people actually participate in field sobriety tests, which you have absolutely no obligation to, and I don't know why anybody would do it, but we'll get to more of that in a little bit. And the third most common mistake is that people do partial cooperation and then clam up and refuse later. So they'll do the field sobriety test, and then when they perform poorly, they will refuse the chemical and blood tests, and we'll talk about why that's a terrible idea also. So the reason that partially cooperating and then shutting down is just as bad of an idea as participating at all is based on how the case gets built. So DUI cases are built on the evidentiary standard of the totality of the circumstances. And the obligation of a driver who's accepted the privilege of driving in their state to give a blood or breath sample is also triggered based on the totality of the circumstances standard. Everything that happens in a DUI investigation, from the very first thing that the officer noticed that caused that officer to conduct a traffic stop, to the officer asking after they've placed somebody under arrest for them to submit to a blood or breath test, all exists inside this closed off universe that we in the legal community call the totality of the circumstances. What most people don't realize though is that they themselves choose what goes inside this closed off universe. And most people, especially people who haven't had anything to drink or any substances in their body, believe that all they have to do is participate and comply and cooperate, and that will work to dispel the officer's suspicion or clear up this big misunderstanding as to why they're standing outside being asked to do field sobriety tests. And that's based on this naive trust that people have in the institution of law enforcement. And as a result, they let the police put pressure on them to participate in this thing that they don't have to participate in. What they don't realize though is that they are actively volunteering to contribute things that go into this totality of the circumstances closed universe. And they do that, again, because they have this sort of naive trust in the institution of law enforcement, and they believe that all they have to do is prove that they're innocent. Well, the problem with that is that, one, we never have to prove that we're innocent of anything because this is a free country and we're free people. And even if we get arrested and charged with something, we still have a legal presumption of innocence. And two, it's nearly impossible to dispel a police officer's suspicion once they've decided that they're suspicious of you for a particular reason. And especially in cases where they're actually incentivized to find crime, and we'll get into more of that in the closing argument. But suffice it to say that you're better off doing what I tell you to do at the end of every video and keeping your mouth shut and keep your evidence to yourself, because everything you do and say gets dropped into this totality of the circumstances world, and you are the person who gets to decide what you give them to put in this universe. I'll give you a couple examples. Let's look at the video of one of the guys that was in this news story that got arrested and exonerated for DUI.
Performing a field sobriety test is not what Jeff Adams expected last September as he was heading to his job as a teacher in Brentwood. Video recorded by an officer shows Adams didn't do well standing on one leg. Still, Adams couldn't believe what happened next.
So the totality of circumstances are these. The officer makes a traffic stop. He says the driver had clues of impairment. He makes observations in talking to the driver that he considered to be suspicious and prompting further investigation for DUI. Let's say slurred speech pattern or bloodshot eyes or watery eyes. He asked the driver to step out of the vehicle. The driver displays poor balance. The officer asked the driver to participate in field sobriety tests, which they agree to do. The person doesn't have nystagmus, but they fail the one leg stand and the walk and turn test. Driver gets arrested, and they give a blood sample because they are required to under the implied consent law based on how they performed on the field sobriety test. All right, so what is the evidence of intoxication in our school teacher case? You have slurred speech, you have unsteady balance, you have 2 out of 3 failure on field sobriety tests, and under the totality of the circumstances, they probably have established probable cause to trigger an obligation under the implied consent law for that person to give a blood or breath test. And thank God they did, because they gave the blood or breath test knowing that they had never had any substances and they were exonerated. But again, if they had participated halfway and then refused, we wouldn't have a way to know. We'll go over that more in a little bit. Now, what is the outcome? 8 months later, after this person shelled out probably $10,000 in lost wages and legal fees, they are exonerated because they had absolutely no substances in their system and they were not guilty of DUI. They were completely sober and their life was entirely ruined because they were a respected teacher. Don't you feel better about the fact that they were innocent and they were just, waiting it out until they could prove that? Now, compare that to the video that I did back in April about Harvey Freebird's attempted DUI arrest and what he chose to put into the closed universe of totality of the circumstances. Now, again, our first driver they decided, they participated, they did the field sobriety test, they performed poorly, they put all that stuff. They answered the officer's questions, they did everything they were supposed to do. They decided what got put into that universe. Well, let's look back at the Harvey Freebird video and we'll figure out what he did to contribute to the totality of the circumstances.
If I committed a crime?
Yes. That's why you're stopped right now.
Okay. Well, write me a ticket, take me to jail.
All right, here's the deal, man.
That means that's the bottom line. If I committed a crime, take me to jail, write me a ticket.
Have you been drinking tonight?
I don't answer questions.
Okay, man, we're going to check your eyes and do a field sobriety test. It's called an SFST,
I don't
standardized.
submit to any searches or seizures.
Okay.
Field sobriety
Nobody's
test.
doing a search and seizure, all right?
I don't submit to anything.
Okay.
What crime did I commit?
Turn around. Put your hands behind your back.
Put my hand. Yes, sir.
Well, now you're being arrested for running a stop sign, all right?
Okay, Harvey ran a stop sign. He actually shows the video at the end of it, and he was pulled over by the police. The officer noted during the encounter the odor of alcohol, slurred speech, bloodshot eyes, whatever. I don't remember exactly what they said, but that's the reasons. They get him out of the car. He shuts down. He refuses to answer any questions. He refuses to do any field sobriety tests. And because he refused those things, we never got to a place where they asked him to submit a blood or breath test under implied consent. So what is the evidence that the officer could testify to of Harvey Freebird's intoxication in his case? Well, he ran a stop sign. That's not evidence of intoxication by itself. Upon contact, he had slurred speech, watery eyes. Well, okay, slurred speech could be based on his normal speech pattern. Watery eyes could be because he's been upset. Bloodshot eyes could be because he has allergies. Officer might testify to an odor of alcohol. Maybe, maybe not. But he ultimately does not get arrested for DUI because they can't raise the reasonable articulable suspicion up to probable cause in order to place him under arrest for DUI. Now, they believed he was DUI, and actually, if you listen to his commentary and read between the lines, he sort of implies that he was drinking. Now, whether or not he was impaired, I don't know. He did a pretty good job of standing up straight and didn't make it obvious that he was impaired, if that was the case. And he obviously had enough wherewithal to refuse all their tests and basically give them the middle finger. And that violated their ego, and they arrested him for a stop sign violation. And the outcome was that he was ultimately released on a citation once he got to the station. So there was ultimately no probable cause under the totality of the circumstances because, again, Harvey chose not to put certain things in the totality of the circumstances universe because he knew better. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with whether or not you give blood or breath under implied consent? Well, you only have to give blood or breath where the officer has established probable cause under the totality of the circumstances that you are impaired. And so probable cause gets built and established based on what you choose to put in the closed universe of the totality of the circumstances. So if you choose to put your poor performance on the field sobriety test that you didn't have to take into that universe, well, that can be used against you. And if you choose to answer the itinerary questions and in a very inebriated way, tell them that we only had 7 beers, officers, just two beers. If you do that, that's going to get used against you. So, and that's actually where Justin Timberlake screwed up. Now, I don't have any idea about what kind of interview he had with the police officer, but apparently, according to the media release, he ended up doing the field sobriety test and performing poorly on them, and then he refused the chemical test. Now, this could work to your advantage if you're actually on a substance. Maybe you beat the DUI, the criminal charge, but you're going to lose your driver's license, and depending on how you did on the field sobriety test and whether or not it's on video, you might lose both. I mean, think about it for a second. Put yourself in the position of a juror. Put yourself in the jury box. Forget for a second that you hate the police and you don't trust anything they say or do. Try to be objective and consider what we just watched on this video. You saw the teacher failing the field sobriety tests miserably. Tell me if all you had to work with and all the information you had was what the officer testified to as far as slurred speech, unsteady balance, and you watched him fail those field sobriety tests, that you wouldn't assume that that person is inebriated. Now again, thank God he gave a blood sample because he was exonerated and it was proven that he just had balance issues and maybe he had some medical conditions that contributed towards that. But if you're a juror and you don't get the exonerating blood tests, and all you have to go on is what the officer testified to and how he did on those field sobriety tests, that guy's getting convicted. In Tennessee, I promise you he's getting convicted. If he had not taken that test and if he had done what Justin Timberlake did and he had done poorly on the tests, and again, I haven't seen the video, so I don't know how bad he did, but depending on how bad Justin Timberlake did on those field sobriety tests on video, he could be convicted of DUI even though he refused the test. Because with no substance test to try to show what he had or didn't have in his system, depending on how bad he looked, the jury will have nothing else to look at except for that. And again, he chose to put that stuff into the evidence of the case. Here's a question for you to consider that might help put this entire idea into context for you. Have you ever been to like a local county fair or a carnival or even an amusement park where they have like the cash games, like ring toss, or where you toss a softball into like a basket or something, right? How often do you play those games? Well, I would say most people, the vast majority of people, don't play the games. And the reason they don't play the games is because they cost money and they're rigged. There's no way to win. So you know that the basket is set up at a certain angle, or the circumference of the ring toss is so close to the bottle that it's nearly impossible to get it at the right angle or the right. That's a field sobriety test. Now, you might be the type of person that's like, well, it's entertaining and it's amusing, and you might throw $5 at it just on the off chance that you can win. But you do that understanding that you're probably not going to win and you're basically just wasting your money in order to be entertained. I would submit to you that that's fine to do at an amusement park or a county fair. But if you were doing a proper risk versus reward calculation, you wouldn't dare risk your liberty on your ability to prevail at the ring toss at a carnival or a county fair or an amusement park. And I would suggest to you that your odds of passing a police officer's field sobriety test or dispelling their suspicion on a DUI investigation are about as good as your odds of prevailing at ring toss. Just saying. So in closing, I just want to share with you guys some of the things that you might not know about the big business that is DUI enforcement in the United States. Due to the lobbying efforts of the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, many states, including my home state of Tennessee, have DUI prosecutors that are entirely funded by grants from the federal government, meaning the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration gives states money to allocate through their highway safety programs for the salary of DUI prosecutors and DUI coordinators that keep up with the paperwork. And so you have people that their entire job is predicated on their ability to convict people of DUI. And you have hundreds of millions of dollars that get poured into extra patrols and DUI checkpoints and getting more officers on the street during strategic times and that kind of thing in order to incentivize police officers to make DUI arrests. Now, I want to say as an aside that one of my very close friends is a grant-funded DUI prosecutor, and I want to just in case the off chance, I don't think he watches my content because I pretty much keep my circle small, and I don't like make the people that care about me in my real life look at my YouTube. But just in case he ever sees this, I do want to say publicly that he is one of the most honest, straightforward people of integrity I've ever met. And he's the only actual DUI prosecutor I've ever known that will sort of go against the grain and dismiss cases outright if the evidence isn't there, or reduce cases that are charged as DUI but that he knows aren't DUI to something that would be appropriate under the circumstances where the evidence doesn't suggest that the state could prevail. But he's the only one that I know of, that I've ever met in my professional life, that doesn't care more about the conviction than they do about whether the right thing is done. And so I just want to say to him, if he ever sees this, that I know that to be the truth with you. But my experience has taught me that that's an exception and not the rule. And this person is also a former police officer who, before he was a lawyer, specialized in DUI enforcement. So he has seen at least a different side of it from the prosecutorial side and understands that some cases just don't need to be pursued. But I remember as a new prosecutor sitting in New Prosecutor Academy and listening to the presentation given by the people who run the Tennessee Highway Safety Office, and them talking about how you shouldn't downgrade cases and you should always pursue prosecution and you shouldn't dismiss cases. And they were literally bragging about the fact that they had gotten a conviction against a kid for Ritalin. So imagine you have a 16 or 17-year-old kid who the doctors have determined needs Ritalin, and he's a nervous kid or whatever, and he gets stopped by a police officer and he decides to do what everybody told him he should do, which is cooperate with the police. And lo and behold, because he uses Ritalin as prescribed at a therapeutic level, he gets convicted of DUI because the law says any substance. And then the evidence suggests that he's not able to, do the field sobriety test, so that translates over into, okay, we must have been too impaired to drive on Ritalin. It's ridiculous, and they're proud of it, and that's the problem. That's big business. So you might think, well, James, you were a police officer, and I'm sure you took plenty of overtime opportunities, and that's true, and I did. And I'm not being critical of people who work overtime to try to make ends meet, because I didn't get paid very much as a police officer, and I was just trying to survive and just do, you know, what I could to make ends meet too. But there are tons of incentives for police officers to go out there and find DUI arrests, and that was never encouraged. When I was a police officer, they gave you the overtime, they wanted you to go out and make contact, but you were never encouraged to make DUI arrests. This is 20 years later. I haven't been a police officer. My law enforcement career was 21 years ago, and I got out over 10 years ago. A lot of police departments don't have any sort of annual awards. Maybe they give somebody who was in a particularly harrowing incident, like maybe the Nashville Metro shooter that killed the Covenant school shooting suspect. They might give somebody like that like a Valor Award, or maybe they give a single award for Officer of the Year, but there's almost always a life-saving award for DUI enforcement. The MAD organizations and their ilk put on multiple banquets and presentations per year awarding officers and recognizing officers for DUI enforcement. And even at the prosecutors conference, there's 2 or 3 awards, and one of them is for a DUI prosecutor of the year. So all I'm trying to say is there's an incentive to pursue and prosecute DUIs. And to consider this for a second. Most police pensions are built on a formula that looks something like this. Like, you get a certain percentage, let's say 60% of your salary for the best 3 of your last 5 years as a pension forever. So let's say that you top out at, say, $60,000. That's $28 an hour, okay? So $60,000, if you get 60% of $60,000, which would be the average of the best 3 of your last 5 years if you're topped out, that means you'd get a $36,000 a year pension for the rest of your life, okay? Take that same officer and let them work DUI or highway safety overtime for their last 3 years. To the tune of, say, let's do 20 hours of pay period. So now that rate becomes $42 an hour on the hours that they work. So 20 hours of pay period at $42 an hour is $840. Okay, and you times that by 26, the number of pay periods typically in a year, bi-weekly pay. And so now that $60,000 a year salary becomes $81,000, almost $82,000. So that gets to be your average. That $82,000 gets to be your average for the best 3 of your last 5 years. And now that instead of that $60,000 a year that was your pension base, now your pension base is $82,000. And so now your pension is not $36,000 a year, it's $49,000 a year at 60%. So now you just raised your pension by working some overtime in the last 3 years of your career. You raised your pension by 36% for the rest of your life. I mean, do you think that that's a possible way to sort of infuse some corruption into the big business of DUI or big government? Well, me too. So that's how you end up with incentivization to go out and find as many DUIs as you possibly can. And that's how you end up with innocent people like the ones in Nashville being arrested for DUI. That's all for this one, guys. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave me a comment on the video. Check out some other videos on the channel and leave me a comment on there as well. Until I see you again, take care. Always film your interactions with the police and keep your evidence to yourself.